We are excited to be joined today by Dr. Shannon Withycombe, an assistant professor in the history department at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Withycombe studied biology during her undergraduate degree before changing course to focus on the social history of medicine, particularly as it applies to women. She received both her master's degree and her PhD in the history of science, medicine, and technology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2005 and 2010. During her postgraduate studies, Dr. Withycombe noticed a significant lack of research on the history of miscarriage, and in an effort to fill this gap, she decided to focus her dissertation on finding and telling the stories of women who experienced miscarriages in 19th century America. Dr. Withycombe described her decision to choose such an unprecedented focus for her dissertation as, quote, brave and foolish at the same time, end quote. Along the way, the project grew into so much more than she expected, and it also became incredibly personal as she became a mom to her two children.
Dr. Withycombe earned her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2010. She did some postgraduate research and teaching at Duke University, where she worked on turning her early research into articles, as well as beginning work on her first book based on her dissertation. A few years later, she took a job at the University of New Mexico, where she's been ever since. In 2018, she published her first book, which gave voice to women's miscarriage experiences in the 19th century. This is really groundbreaking research because no one had ever really studied this topic in significant detail before. In fact, when Dr. Withycombe began researching this subject when she chose it as her dissertation topic, she said she wasn't sure she would find any information, let alone enough to write a book about. Fortunately, she did. We are so excited for the opportunity to hear about this fascinating research today. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Shannon Withycombe.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'm sad I can't see all the faces, but I can see there's a lot of you out there, and that's pretty exciting. I'd like to thank Rebecca for the initial invitation here and for all the work that Valerie has done to put this together, and especially to Becca and Cassidy for that lovely introduction. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and start my screen share, which I know always takes a minute, and it's always one of those great TikToks to imitate your professor putting up the screen share, but I'll sort of talk as I'm sharing as well. So today's talk is based on the research I did for my first book, but I will note that a lot of the themes that I found in the first, in this first book I'm carrying over into my next big research project, which is about the development of prenatal health care in the United States in the early 20th century. So I'll go ahead and get started. In 1846, Susan Shelby Mcgoffin wrote in her diary of losing her first pregnancy, and she wrote with sadness but acceptance. In 1875, Annie Van Ness instead wrote of her happiness after losing her first pregnancy. While there are many personal, familial, and social reasons for this differences in their reactions to miscarriage, I also want to look at larger historical changes between 1846 and 1875 that influenced how these women felt upon the event of miscarriage. This talk will explore the history of miscarriage in the United States and how national, social, and racial policies and fears of the late 19th century shaped how both physicians and women interpreted, reacted to, and understood pregnancy loss. Prior to the 1870s, most American physicians described their roles in miscarriage cases as helping nature. In January of 1852, Virginia physician P. Claiborne Gooch attended a 38-year-old mother of 3 who had been, quote, ailing and sore throughout the night. She'd been suffering the pains for days, but only when they became grinding and benumbing and felt similar to labor pains did she call for a doctor. Gooch examined the woman, who he left unnamed, in his report of the case that was published in the Ohio Medical and Surgical Journal, and discovered her to be 5 to 6 months pregnant and passing a good deal of blood. Determining that a miscarriage was unavoidable, he later described, quote, I quietly took my bedside seat till nature accomplished her duty, mine being merely to send the husband out of the room and to inform the woman that the accident must take place. Around midnight, the woman finally expelled the fetus with little active aid from the doctor. This lack of action or waiting upon nature was quite common for physicians throughout the first 2/3 of the 19th century, who claimed that miscarriage was nature's way of getting rid of pregnancy that was already going wrong. American doctors seemed quite content to attend these cases, sit quietly by, perhaps provide some pain relief or a warm brandy as follow-up. Perhaps because of this lack of action, many American women did not call on doctors for help in cases of miscarriage. American women more likely described miscarriage as a routine part of reproduction and an event best attended to by themselves or family or friends. Physicians' insistence upon the power of nature in such cases gave even greater support to the lay idea that miscarriage was not an emergency requiring any particular medical training or treatment. 30 years later, however, physicians' writings about miscarriage were completely different. By the last 2 decades of the 19th century, American doctors seemed agreed that the best course of action in all cases of miscarriage was immediate and instrumentally intrusive action. What changed? Well, it turns out a lot changed about America and American society between the 1850s and 1880s, and many of these non-medical transformations had lasting impacts on how physicians approached miscarriage. Starting in the 1850s, the United States was experiencing rapid industrialization and saw unprecedented immigration, altering the logistics and meaning of family and reproduction. As manufacturing increased with the Industrial Revolution, male and female workers moved into cities, leaving much of their traditions behind, along with their extended families. Urban workers, separated from families and familiar communities, also lost access to traditional and folk knowledge of health, illness, and miscarriage. Immigration rates, which had measured around 60,000 a year in 1800, sharply rose to almost 2 million a year by 1850, bringing to East Coast cities and towns young workers who were isolated again from familiar reproductive knowledge and practices. In 1850, university-educated white male physicians delivered a minority of babies and attended even fewer pregnant and miscarrying women. Most of the families relying on doctors for childbirth at this time were wealthy and educated themselves, using physicians as evidence of their high positions in society. But as urban working populations grew, and this growth coincided with an increased interest by American doctors in gaining clinical experience during their training and experimental populations after medical school, white upper-class male physicians began coming into contact with more and more poor immigrant and women of color in ways they never had before. One thing I want to make sure is this is not a story of physicians forcing themselves upon these populations. Rather, women and their partners were the ones instigating this new clinical picture of miscarriage. In large cities like Boston and New York, but also in smaller towns along the East Coast, immigrant groups sought out physicians in much larger numbers starting in the 1870s and 1880s. Women who could not afford a physician or midwife, did not have the space to give birth in their homes, were separated from the assistance of family, or who could not admit their pregnancies to their family, usually because they were unmarried, needed a new location to give birth. And charitable hospitals and dispensaries fit that bill. Some already in existence by the 1880s, but many more built at this time for this very purpose. And this is just one example of a women's health clinic and dispensary that was built at this time period in Philadelphia. Increased interactions between educated white physicians and less powerful women over miscarriage was not a trend limited to large urban centers or charitable hospitals. Many families outside of the big cities, but still employed by the broader industrialized world, looked to physicians for aid in cases of miscarriage, such as the patients of Charles Brayton. Brayton was one of 9 physicians in the town of Stonington, Connecticut, a seaside community that served as home to many immigrants who worked in the wool and cotton mills, in the vibrant shipping industry, or as servants in the house of the more prestigious white families of power. In 1880, Stonington was home to just over 7,000 residents, 17% who were foreign-born, 38% had at least one foreign-born parent, and 3% identified on the census as Black or mulatto. By comparison, the women who sought out Dr. Brayton for cases of miscarriage, 47% were immigrants and 8% were identified by Brayton as, quote, colored. While working class immigrant communities comprised a minority of Stonington's overall population, they ended up accounting for the majority of Brayton's patient base in cases of miscarriage. Couples such as Louis and Louise Rossum from Germany, Joseph and Delphina Maria from the Azores, Olaf and Josephine Rude from Norway, and Michael and Catherine Harrington from Ireland, all sought out Brayton for aid, most likely because they had left family and traditional healers behind in their home countries. As American doctors began seeing more and more miscarriage cases, they began to change how they understood their own role in the event and began to increase their business and authority over the medical meanings of miscarriage. But we cannot forget that they succeeded in the medicalization of miscarriage, not because their claims to knowing more about the event or having any better instruments or treatments or preventions than any other medical or lay person, but rather because women like Delphina Mariah had nowhere else to turn when she began bleeding in the 4th month of her pregnancy. Now let's turn back to Susan Mcgoffin for this last point about how physicians started to care about miscarriage. At 18 and newly married, Mcgoffin set out in 1846 with her husband and his brother on a 6-week trip from Missouri into Chihuahua, Mexico, down the Santa Fe Trail on a trading and diplomatic mission. The night before leaving, that it was a new scene in her life, quote, a stride that I myself can scarcely realize, in all the excitement of an 18-year-old. Mcgoffin had rarely left her home in Kentucky before this adventure. While on a stop at Bent's Fort, an important fur trading camp in the base of on the Santa Fe Trail, Mcgoffin's diary took on a new tone. On what was her 19th birthday, she recorded feeling strange and finally excitedly disclosed, "I am sick!" exclamation mark. We might ask why she felt excitement over illness, but Mcgoffin was not ill. She was instead relying on a common 19th century convention and using the term sick to mean pregnant. The next morning, Mcgoffin was not so excited, but it would be a week before she could write, quote, in a few short months, I should have been a happy mother and made the heart of a father glad. But the ruling hand of a mighty providence has interposed, and by an abortion deprived us of the hope. I will say, as an aside, the word abortion was used both by women and doctors throughout the 19th century to mean an accidental termination of pregnancy. If anyone wanted to refer to a purposeful termination of pregnancy, they would usually call it a criminal abortion. She continued to describe what had taken place the previous week, her pains, that the Fort doctor provided her with some pain relief, and then, quote, all was over. She had been bedridden ever since, recovering from her ordeal. In an attempt to understand both her miscarriage and her need for convalescence in bed under the direct supervision of the Fort's physician, Dr. Measure, Mcgoffin reflected upon someone else who had been at the Fort. Quote, an Indian woman in the room below me. As Mcgoffin wrote, she gave birth to a fine, healthy baby about the same time. And in half an hour after she went to the river and bathed herself in it. Never could I have believed such a thing if I had not been here. Continuing her reflection, Mcgoffin thought more about the differences between herself and the woman in the room below. Quote, no doubt many ladies in civilized life are ruined by too careful treatments during childbirth, for this custom of the heathen is not known to be disadvantageous, but is a heathenish custom. Tragically, 9 years later, back in the civilized world of Missouri, Mcgoffin died due to complications of the birth of her 4th child. Mcgoffin's use of the words civilized and heathen in a discussion about reproduction was not random. By the 1840s, white male physicians had been building a stable foundation for their role in the birthing process based upon social and scientific understandings of race and ethnicity. Historians such as Nora Doyle, Deidre Cooper Owens, and Miriam Rich have brilliantly described the utility of particular racial narratives about birth in America as professionalizing tools. White male physicians in the late 1700s throughout Europe seeking business and cultural authority began claiming special expertise over the birthing process based on university education, which primarily included anatomical drawings like this and not clinical experience, familiarity with tools such as forceps, and generous use of morphine. And the gentleman on this slide is probably the most famous of these newly labeled man midwives of the 18th century, William Hunter. They claimed their methods were far superior to those of midwives, which were less intrusive, less anatomical, and for many women, much gentler methods. According to these new quote unquote male midwives, only they could protect the woman and child from the possible death and debility of childbirth. However, these new practitioners were not interested in protecting all women from the horrors of birth, only those women deemed valuable to the nation or culture, i.e. white, middle, and upper class women. Other groups labeled savage, primitive, or heathen did not need medical attention because, according to doctors, they were naturally impervious to labor pains, stronger of body, and less affected by death than their white, quote, civilized counterparts. While these ideas originated in wealthy urban centers in Europe, they quickly came over to America, where regular physicians were eager to find ways to drive alternative practitioners, including midwives, out of the crowded medical marketplace. As an additional bonus, these biological notions of race help support the most profitable mechanism for many white Americans, slavery. If physicians and enslavers believed that Black women were naturally impervious to pain and lacking in the more gentle emotions of white women, such as maternal love and sexual modesty, then where was the problem with some of the more horrific practices under slavery, including rape, separation of women from their infants, or demanding women go back to grueling work hours after giving birth? These narratives were firmly entrenched in American medicine and white society at large by the 1840s, when Susan Mcgoffin speculated on the treatment of civilized women such as herself. And more white physicians found themselves involved in miscarriage cases with poor immigrant or women of color. The view of the hardened bodies of the, quote, primitive women that doctors encountered in miscarriage cases, especially by the 1870s, allowed them to intrude upon these bodies in ways that would not have been appropriate or even allowed upon the bodies if they were white and upper class. If physicians believed that miscarrying women at a charity hospital or dispensary were less delicate in physical health and in sensibilities than his private practice patients, then he might not have thought twice about sticking one or both of his hands up into her vagina and uterus. Jabbing a sharp metal instrument into her birth canals would not have seemed controversial. In contrast, when physicians attended an upper or middle class white woman for miscarriage and birth, this encounter typically occurred in the woman's home, where she had authority and control over the experience. It's quite plausible that physicians did not consider the use of intrusive treatments in their private practices because they assumed their patients would refuse such intimate and painful procedures. And in that setting, where the woman had the power to refuse and the power not to pay the practitioner, physicians had to listen to her. In contrast, in charity hospitals or for doctors like Dr. Brayton, who are the last resort for poor and desperate women, women did not have the power of refusal or even the power to express shock or discomfort. It was in this setting that American physicians could experiment and develop a routine miscarriage treatment, stated by one physician as to empty the uterus as soon as that can be done with safety, to thoroughly ascertain it is entirely empty, and never cease supervision of the case until that end is accomplished. Most of these doctors recommended emptying the uterus with metal instruments like curettes, often using words like scraping, force, and violence. This intrusion into women's bodies in a newly intimate and often violent manner was only made possible by the poor immigrant and women of color that, out of desperation, called for help when they found themselves bleeding and in pain. As more and more women sought out physicians in cases of miscarriage, they also began to interpret the event in a more positive light. This might seem counterintuitive if you're familiar with the gender narratives of late 19th century America. As women began moving into higher education, the workforce, out onto streets for public activism, and into new halls of consumption like the newly developed department stores, many men in power, such as politicians and physicians, began speaking out, reminding women that their natural duty, their biological duty, was to remain home and birth and raise children. In such a context, I certainly expected that miscarriage would be viewed as a failure of femininity or a shameful event in a woman's life. But that wasn't what I found in the archives. Remember Annie Van Ness? Luckily for me, Annie Van Ness kept a diary for most of her life. In January of 1874, Van Ness was 26 years old and had been married to her husband Theodore for a little over a year. Just prior to the marriage, her husband had lost most of his wealth in the Panic of 1873, and the couple, planning on living in Manhattan, was forced to relocate to Yonkers soon after their wedding. And Annie was very much displeased about living in Yonkers. She repeatedly talked about it in her diary. Van Ness was very concerned about money and kept a running tally of her expenses. The year before she wed, she had spent $142.32 for the entire year. Her first year of marriage, she only spent $68.48. Van Ness kept a regular diary for years, and on that January day, she opened with disclosing how, quote, very cross and irritable she was and remarking, I think I have a very good reason to feel ill-humored. The following month, she reported, I don't know that I'm in much better humor than when I last wrote, as the cause of it still exists. Van Ness was pregnant and apparently not very excited by the prospect. 2 weeks later, however, her mood changed. Quote, quite a change has come over the spirit of my dreams since I last wrote, and I am happy again. A week ago last night, I was taken sick at the supper table. I went to my room and retired early. To make a long story short, I will say the next day, Ma told me she had seen her first grandchild. Van Ness quickly amended the report. I just happen to think that anybody might imagine from reading this that I had a baby, but I haven't. It was only what they call a miscarriage. Van Ness was not the only woman I found in the archives expressing happiness, relief, and joy in the wake of a miscarriage. In June of 1879, Mary Cheney wrote a letter to her husband, Frank, revealing her latest pregnancy. The Cheneys lived very comfortably in Connecticut, where Frank and his brothers owned and managed a silk business that boasted 600 workers and an annual production of over $500,000. Frank often traveled the country promoting silk, leaving historians a treasure trove of letters between the couple. Mary described this latest pregnancy to her husband, quote, "I was not mistaken about myself when you went away, but it's all right. I'm feeling perfectly well, and everyone says I really believe this is London." Mary had spent 16 years in near constant reproduction, pregnant with, birthing, and nursing 9 children. The following month, she updated her husband on her condition, this time telling him about the loss of the latest pregnancy. She opened the letter, "Oh bliss, oh rapture unforeseen. The imaginary number 10, whom I had already begun to love, is not a real entity as yet, and I hope will not be for a long time to come." Cheney would have 3 more children, giving birth to her 12th child at the age of 44. In order to understand these positive emotional responses to an event much more commonly described today as a loss, a failure, or a tragedy, we need to again look to the reproductive realities and limitations in the late 19th century. The 1840s to the 1860s was a bit of a golden age for reproductive control for most American women. The Industrial Revolution, while separating many of these women from their mothers or other networks of familiar women who could pass along helpful advice about encouraging or preventing pregnancy, also helped spur on an increase in the availability of contraception in unprecedented ways. The vulcanization of rubber, developed in 1844, meant that condoms, diaphragms, and postcoital douching syringes could be made much more durable, comfortable, and cheaper than what was previously available. Improvements in pill manufacturing increased the array of contraceptive pills as well as tonics and syrups that flooded the market. And the print revolution gave space for all of these entrepreneurs to market directly to women through mail order catalogs, print ads in newspapers and magazines, and on posters on bustling urban street corners. Finally, as part of a broader American movement of education and self-improvement, knowledge of anatomy and physiology became a highly sought-after commodity, peddled in millions of domestic health guides, on lecture circuit tours, and even by door-to-door salesmen. This physiology often included methods for fertility control, now newly available to any woman who could read or afford to attend a public lecture. Fertility control was everywhere. And this is one of the more famous or best-selling authors, rather, of this movement, Dr. Frederick Hollick, who wrote a couple books and also lectured extensively throughout the entire United States. And most of his lectures included some information on withdrawal and the rhythm method. In the wake of the Civil War, as immigration not only exploded, but the majority now came from new parts of the world deemed by most white Americans as too foreign. And lawmakers became newly concerned about which families were having babies and which ones weren't. Fertility rates had been falling steadily throughout the 19th century, with the most precipitous drop between 1850 and 1900. This decrease in family size can be directly linked to industrialization, urbanization, and the creation of the middle class. These numbers alone were concerning to many in power, especially to those who feared what this would mean for the size of workforce, military, and other groups that relied upon mass numbers, but also for those who feared what American women were doing instead of having babies. Again, sort of seeking out higher education, entering professional fields, and starting to agitate in public activism. But what made many lawmakers even more nervous was the racial fertility rates. Black and immigrant women were not decreasing their fertility as the same rates as white women. What was going to become of the nation if this trend was not altered? What would happen to white supremacy? For the Congress of 1873, the answer to these concerns came from a New York anti-vice crusader named Anthony Comstock. The Comstock Act, which is pictured here, of 1873, banned the use of the US Postal Service to mail any number of obscene materials, including contraceptive devices and information. So after 1873, it was now illegal to send a letter to your newly married sister and tell her about the rhythm method. Very quickly, most states passed what we now call mini Comstocks that banned the manufacture, advertisement, sale, publication, and in the most stringent laws, the use of contraceptive methods and devices. Let me provide one more example to help us better understand how so many American women felt trapped in the closing decades of the 19th century, aware that there were ways to stop reproducing, but unable to access them. One more picture. Alice Kirk married her childhood friend Ben Grierson in 1854. While the early years were financially rocky, the family found its footing after Ben found success in the Army and after the Civil War. Alice followed her husband around Kansas, the Indian Territory, and the District of New Mexico, keeping house and caring for their ever-growing band of young children. In 1871, the family was stationed at Fort Sill in Indian Territory when their youngest child, a little girl named Mary Louisa, died at 3 months. This child was their seventh, and the grief from her death, along with health problems stemming from the difficult birth, drove Alice Grierson to her parents' home in Ohio to recuperate, leaving all the children behind with Ben. Ben was not happy with this relocation and repeatedly wrote to Alice asking when she would return home. Grierson replied, quote, "There's no use in going it blind when we both have eyes to see and common sense to comprehend the facts of the case. Both of us know one thing which will inevitably occur if the good Lord permits us to meet again, and are both well aware of the possible consequences which may follow. We are the temples of the living God, and these temples must never again be desecrated by an incomplete act of union." In effect, Grierson was telling her husband that she was tired of getting pregnant, but she was not comfortable with one of the only methods of birth control available, withdrawal. In a heartbreaking admission and peek into the reproductive realities that women in 19th century America experienced, Grierson then listed off her children and described how she felt at each pregnancy. "Charlie's existence I accepted as a matter of course, without either joy or sorrow. Kirky's with regret for so soon succeeding him. Robert came nearer being welcomed with joy than any other. Edie was gladly welcomed as soon as I knew her sex. Henry succeeded her too soon to give me as much rest as I would have liked, and I told you before he was a year old that I would rather die than have another child. Yet no sooner was he weaned than Georgie came into life. I firmly believe it injured me as soon as I weaned him and was again immediately pregnant. My nerves became so irritable to such a degree that life has ever since been near a burden to me." After this litany, it's not surprising to read Grierson report that her nerves, after 11 years of such preparation, quote, "had arrived at such a pitch of sensitiveness that I will need large and long continued doses of rest and quiet to soothe them." Exhausted by a married life of never-ending pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing, Grierson resorted to placing hundreds of miles between herself and her husband. This was the only way she could think to put a stop to the pregnancies. So in 1875, when Annie Van Ness expressed outright joy at her miscarriage, we should not only look to her personal circumstances to explain that joy. Yes, she was worried about money. Yes, she was also trying to create a new relationship with what she referred to as a troublesome new stepson. By the same token, Mary Cheney was juggling 9 children, the youngest only 9 months old. We also need to recognize that Van Ness and Cheney were living in a new reproductive world. Contraception was illegal, leaving unsafe black market fertility control devices and concoctions or unreliable homemade methods as their only avenue for preventing pregnancy. In addition, Van Ness and Cheney were living in a new world that repeatedly told them, through advertisements, federal policies, and popular discourse, that their fertility was the most important, that them having babies was going to save the country from the downfall to which it was currently headed. The racialized reproductive narratives and realities of reproductive control limitations in the late 19th century shaped women's emotional responses and emotional relationships with miscarriage. Thank you. I'll go ahead and stop sharing now. Thank you.
Am I good to share now, Valerie? Okay. Dr. Withycombe's research informs us of the way that medical developments and the introduction of laws throughout American history have changed the way that women view miscarriage. Her work also demonstrates the way that women and their partners have an effect on the medical community and on medical research regarding women's reproductive health. As more and more women approached the medical community for help during miscarriage and birth, more medical professionals became involved in the process and developed new ways of handling them. It is important to recognize the role that women of color and those of lower social classes played in the development of medical care used during miscarriage and birth. Because of their position in society, doctors felt that it was acceptable to experiment with new procedures on them, including extremely painful and invasive procedures in response to miscarriage. These women were also dismissed as heathen by many upper-class white women, which furthered the idea that it was appropriate to experiment on them, as it made them seem less than human. We owe much of the information gained on medical procedures regarding miscarriage to those women who were experimented on. We should also recognize the role that legislation plays in the way that we view reproduction. When laws are enacted that make contraception illegal, women are faced with a life where their body is no longer their own because they are constantly pregnant or breastfeeding. For women in this situation, miscarriage may be seen as a blessing rather than as something to mourn over, which is evidenced by the experiences of women who lived in the time of the Comstock Act of 1873. The experience of the women during that time shows us the importance of respecting women's reproductive autonomy, including their right to use any contraceptive methods that they see fit. With the information given today in mind, as members of the global women's studies community, we should be careful not to judge women based on their reaction to miscarriage, as it is an extremely personal experience. For some who did not wish to be pregnant, it may be seen as a blessing. For women who desperately want to have a child, miscarriage may be seen as a tragedy. We must respect the reactions of both women, being careful not to impose our own ideas or beliefs about the situation. As a community, we should encourage others to be respectful of the individual reactions of these women as well. Future research may address the way that modern medicine and the current availability of contraceptives have affected the way that women view miscarriage today. This may include examining the role of emergency departments in handling cases of miscarriage, hospital births, and the trouble many women face getting insurance to cover contraceptive methods, and the way that many contraceptive methods are currently kept in locked boxes or behind the pharmacy counter in grocery stores. Examining these things may help us to be more understanding of women's individual feelings on reproduction, birth, and miscarriage. I will now turn the time over to Chloe Emery for the Q&A.
Okay, thank you for that wonderful presentation. Our first question is from Eliza Bennett, and she asked, in what ways do we see echoes of these restrictive policies in US reproductive policy today?
Well, certainly we can see echoes of these racialized narratives of reproduction in terms of sort of who deserves or who is maybe more valuable as a mother. And usually, again, these are about mothers. These are not even today, right, about fatherhood to the same extent. So I think one of the things I'm trying to do in the work that I'm doing now is connect those dots, connect sort of these early racialized narratives about, right, which kind of bodies are naturally both sort of better at birth, but also, you know, less impervious to pain, to some very frightening current racial disparities in health, right? So Black women, I think their rate of maternal mortality is 5 times that of white women. I'm not sure. I think it's somewhere between 3 and 5 times that of white women today. And so I think that is certainly one of the continuation of these narratives is there's still, it's sort of built into our medical system, these sort of systemic racism that these particular understandings about whether or not a physician should listen to a Black woman, for example, in the midst of birth when she thinks something is going wrong. That happens a lot less than if a white woman says, I think there's something going wrong. And I think that is definitely connected to the history.
Awesome, thank you. The next question comes from Lily Bitter, and it says, how much of modern medical knowledge came from the coercive use of bodies of marginalized women, and how do we honor these women for their contributions?
That's a really great question, and one that is very much debated today. So I think this question might be somewhat connected to J. Marion Sims, who I think is the most sort of well-known figure. So Sims, for at least a sort of 150 years was celebrated as the father of gynecology and was one of the first American physicians to really enter into an international stage. Sort of prior to his work in the 1830s to 1850s, most European medical circles did not see the United States as doing anything interesting or important in medicine. So Sims, one of the things he did after doing his work was sort of take an international tour as a way to sort of drum up this reputation of American medicine. Sims, however, what he was most well known for was the repair of vesicle vastula fistulas, which is sort of a tear that can happen after birth, especially if the woman has other illnesses or malnourished, and usually of lower socioeconomic status, and that is current, and it still happens today. But how he figured out how to fix this is he borrowed, leased, and bought multiple enslaved Black women, and then carried out up to, I know on one of them, it was up to 40 different surgeries on her without anesthesia, trying out different needles and threads and all kinds of stuff. And so this is, it's only in the past even sort of 5 years that historians have been saying, like, look, we need to, I mean, he had a statue up in Central Park for a long time. It just got taken down, I think 2 years ago. But a lot of historians, especially women of color, right, saying, hey, I don't think we should be celebrating this guy to the extent that we are. But it's still an ongoing discussion. And it's one that unfortunately right now still sort of pits doctors against historians in a way that I don't think is very useful. But I agree that I think there have been some really interesting public art projects, as well as a little bit more historical literature written about the women themselves rather than Sims. So Betsy, Anarcha, and Lucy are the name of the 3 women he used the most. And so that I think that is one way to sort of honor them a little bit more, certainly, is just to even use their names, which for a long time historians were not doing, and medical practitioners were not doing.
Okay, then Amy asked, have you done research on miscarriages in other areas of the world? And if so, do you see similar trends and practices?
I haven't, but I will say when I started this historical research, one of the places I looked was in anthropology of pregnancy loss, to see sort of what are some of the questions that I might be asking of my research. And that is where I did get some of my sort of theoretical framing and initial research questions is there has been, I know, anthropological work done on various cultures showing more of that intersection between sort of emotional and social responses to miscarriage and how it's tied into other reproductive realities and limitations. So I know there was one, and the name of the author escapes me right now, but that was looking at pregnancy loss in very poor communities in South America. And one of the sort of responses was, or sort of one of the sort of contexts was very high infant mortality rate. And so one of the things that she noticed was sort of how women were conceptualizing their pregnancies and in a way that I think probably made the miscarriage not as devastating in a way that our current Western culture, I think one of the reasons it is devastating is because we have things like early pregnancy tests and so much commercialization of pregnancies from day one. But that was sort of seeing those sort of cultural connections and helped me with the early stages of the work, certainly.
That was very interesting. I'm glad you brought up anthropology because that can really help feed research questions. But Hannah Robison asked, how can understanding the history of miscarriage in women's healthcare help us to navigate advocating for improving healthcare and sex ed today?
Great question. One that I am sort of a crusader on, certainly. So in addition to sort of what I was talking about, the racial narratives, I mean, certainly one of the reasons why I started this project in the first place was sort of as women around me, because I started it before I started my own family, but I saw women around me having miscarriages. And one of the things I kept hearing was like, why didn't anyone tell me how common it was? And I think, and it's only sort of recently, there have been a couple studies about sort of feelings of shame, feelings of guilt, and a lot of sort of mental health implications in the wake of miscarriage, and how that might be connected to the sort of cultural silence we have around miscarriage. So one of the things I'm certainly interested in doing is I try to sort of, not just with my book, but I do other sort of public facing writings about miscarriage to call attention also to the sort of, I think there are current problems with how we talk about miscarriage, and the fact that we don't really talk about miscarriage. I mean, it's been a little bit better in the past few years, right? You get sort of celebrity stories of particular celebrities talking about their miscarriage. But I think that the sort of silence increases a woman's sense of guilt or shame when it happens, right? If you've never heard of anyone having a miscarriage, if no one ever tells you when you get pregnant that it's up to 30% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage, then you have a miscarriage, I think it's very automatic to think, I did something wrong. Especially because we also live in a world where there's this sort of popular historical narrative that over the 20th century, because of fertility control, because of artificial reproduction, that every pregnancy can and should result in a healthy baby. And so if you have a miscarriage under that sort of umbrella, it can be, I think, really damaging. And so part of the thing I'm trying to do is show a different, with the historical work, right, is to try to show a different possibility. Not that I think we need to go back to the 19th century, because there's a lot of things wrong in the 19th century, but just to show, right, there are other ways that to both conceptualize pregnancy and to conceptualize miscarriage that can be less damaging to women.
Okay. Hannah Hawes asked, when did the ban on contraceptives get lifted, and how did that affect the attitudes about miscarriage?
The bans got lifted state by state at different times. The first states were in the teens and 20s. The last state, so there was a Supreme Court case in 1965 that finally ruled banning contraception from married couples as unconstitutional. And then it was in 1973 that the ban to unmarried people was finally lifted. So it took about 100 years. In terms of, I think it did somewhat affect how people thought about miscarriage, but I think not until much later, not until sort of the 60s and 70s, was it much more common to have narratives of, if you want to have children, you should be able to, you can under modern medicine, and they should all result in a healthy baby. And that I think has to do with both the legalization of contraception, but also sort of advances in things like artificial insemination and artificial reproductive technologies.
Okay, and it's 12:50, so this will be our final question, but I think it's a very interesting one to end on. Andy Shepard asked, do you feel like we still don't get the whole story of these women because journals only give a certain perspective? And if so, what are we missing? And do you think they were being honest in their journals? And yeah.
That's a great question. I think too often historians and history students sort of see a journal as like the most close you can get to someone's thoughts, right? Why would they not write the full truth in their journal? But we need to, as historians, recognize things like letters and diaries are a constructed historical source, just like everything else, just like a newspaper report, just like a physician's report. And I don't think there's any way really to get to an individual woman's true feelings or true thoughts about it. And I'm very careful in my work to sort of say that, to be like this, this is not, I don't know how much that maybe Annie Van Ness was kind of sad about this. Certainly Mary Chaney talks about being kind of conflicted, like, I'm really happy this happened, but I already loved it, so it's a little confusing. But for me, these personal writings, especially in how positive I found some of them to be, are more about sort of what was possible and acceptable at that time, right? That these women could, in diaries, but also in letters to family members, to close family, to sisters, mothers, and husbands, how open they were about miscarriage, I think does give us an indication for sort of certainly cultural and social trends. But you're right, there's no way to really get at what they're thinking and everything that sort of goes into that emotional response as well.
Okay, thank you so much for your time, and we'll turn the time back over to Valerie Hegstrom for final thoughts.
Thank you.
Well, I just want everybody to please give a round of applause again to Dr. Withycombe for being here with us and for her great presentation and her research, which I think is so important about women's health. And thank all of you for attending. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks. And hopefully you'll come to the activities for Women's History Month next week as well. Please take care. Have a good week.